Well, as I've shared with some of you, I'm getting, in a couple weeks, I'm getting ready to go down to the Midwest, North Dakota. And so, there's a plague of ringneck pheasants for the townspeople, and we're trying to relieve them of that. And so Maeve and I are going to go down and do what we can to make that happen. But you go to that part of the country, you got to brush up on your Ole and Lena jokes, right? Everybody knows about Ole and Lena. Anybody from the Midwest? You're pretty, And so it turns out that Ole was applying for a job. And so the guy looks at him and he says, well, you look like you're pretty well qualified, but what's this 4-year gap in your resume? And Ole said, well, yeah, that is when I went to Yale. The guy says, oh, Yale, that's fantastic. Great, you're hired. He said, oh, great, because I really need the job. Takes a while, let it sink in. Anyway, now I'm going to go in a little different direction, but not get dark on you, but talk about some matters of some concern. Like you, I've sort of watched the news these past few weeks with growing concern. And, seeming random acts of violence against houses of worship during services has really got my radar up, and probably should have yours up too. As houses and churches and synagogues, houses of worship and synagogues are supposed to be places of refuge, from the chaos and violence of the world around them. And when that chaos and violence literally comes crashing through your door, it's completely unsettling. It really is. And, so this is, and it seems that this has always been so. I mean, we hear the prophet Habakkuk, yell out, destruction and violence are before me. There is strife and clamorous discord, and Paul, adjures or admonishes and encourages Timothy not to go with the spirit of cowardice. But it makes you wonder sometimes if anything is really sacred anymore in our society. And, the answer, of course, is absolutely. Absolutely, there are sacred things in our society. In the church, for example, we sanctify, literally set aside for God. If you're going to make something holy, or if anything is, or make it sacred, then you set it aside for God. In the church, we sanctify, set aside for God 3 things. We set aside people, places, and time. And let's talk about people first. By our baptism, we Christians are, as St. Peter says, a chosen race, a royal priesthood, a holy nation, a people set apart, sanctified. Further, within the body of Christ, each of us is set aside for some specific vocation and ministry for the church and for the world. We understand, now that might be for some of us, it's ordained ministry. For some of us, it could be our call to vocation to married life, to holy orders, holy matrimony. It could be for something very specific within the body of Christ. And even if you break it even on down, we've got all the ministries in the parish. And even though the church will be servers and Eucharistic and extraordinary Eucharistic ministers and ministers of music and ministers of hospitality, lectors and ushers and so many more, and so many good things that go on in the parish. We are set aside, sanctified for God, called by God to return to God with increase. And we understand as Christians that some people are set aside so that all people may be dedicated to God. In a similar way, we sanctify time. And, I keep talking about my 10 minutes a day, and I'm not going to back off on that. But we make holy hours. We celebrate holy days. That's where the word holiday comes from, by the way. So if somebody says to you, happy holidays in a few weeks to come, you can say that because they're actually saying holy days. They just don't know it. It's really cool. We see how we sneak it into the language even there. We have Holy Week. We have sacred seasons of Advent, Christmas, Lent, and Easter. And personally, we set time aside as families for prayer. We set time aside as individuals for prayer. We need to. We set aside certain special times so that all time may be made holy. And finally, we sanctify certain places, homes first. If you haven't had your home blessed, give me a call. You would live in one that wasn't. But we do that, especially homes, because that's where the church exists first. And if it's happening at home, then what we do here makes a lot of sense. But the domestic church, homes need to be sanctified. We have holy people. If you think about it, what makes the temple holy? Is it the building itself, or the ones who dwell there? Same thing with a home. What makes the home a holy place? Is it the building itself, or is it the people, the family that dwells there? And so we sanctify homes, chapels, cemeteries, shrines, churches, large and small. We set aside certain places so that all places may become holy and know the presence of God. Now, the evil one understands this, and he does not like it. Therefore, it is no surprise that churches and houses of worship would eventually become a target in an increasingly secularized society that separates us from God, that is slipping ever more precariously into chaos and violence. Secular humanism, so highly touted by so many, is impotent in the face of the momentum of the culture of death so rightly identified by Pope St. John Paul II. So if the scriptures we read today are any indication, it has always been thus. It has always been thus. We need to be prudent and take the steps necessary to ensure the safety of our children and our congregation. But at the same time, we must not fail to be Christian, hospitable, welcoming to those who seek refuge and meaning within these walls from the chaos that is so much outside of them. It's a delicate balancing act, isn't it? It really is. But one which the church has mastered over 20 centuries. So some practical stuff. After consulting with a security contractor, we're going to continue to implement certain reasonable, prudent steps to ensure the safety of those here on campus. But in doing so, we must never lose sight of who we are or who we proclaim to the world. I'll share a little thing that Dolores Reichert, she was one of these women who had lived her life pretty hard, and she was a very practical woman. And at a time that was very low in the church in 2002, we had kind of a listening session, and there was during the sexual scandals of the early 2000s, and so we gathered as a community, as a parish, in the basement of St. Andrew's, and people were just sharing what disturbed them about what had been going on in their church, and rightfully so. And it was kind of a downer evening at that point in the evening, because I asked people, just tell me what bothers you. So they did. Of course, then we had a break, and everybody brought their comfort food. It was one of the best. It was one of the best potlucks you've ever seen. You had brownies, you had pizza, you had soups. Any comfort food was right there. It was great. And then the second hour, we talked about, okay, what needs to happen. And we ended very hopefully and in great prayer, and we moved forward as a community together. But near the end of that first hour, things were pretty down. And Dolores, who is a woman of great faith and practical wisdom, and who had been a smoker all her life, so she had one of those gravelly voices, she looks at people. And whenever in situations like this, I always bring this up. And she looked around, she had enough. She says, people! Jesus said the gates of hell would not prevail against the church. He didn't say they wouldn't try really hard. I could have kissed her. I didn't. But there's wisdom there, isn't there? There is wisdom and there is hope. And we have to remember that. So let us acknowledge the reality of the world that we live in. And let us employ prudent, very charitable measures, safety measures. But let us also strive and continue to strive to be the heart, the arms, the hands of Christ, reaching out to those who seek him, especially those here in 99516.